to find a place to go to in this new hostile climate. I mean, the links to the networks between former SS at that time, they've been portrayed in the movies as a little over-exaggerated, that they were somehow planning to kind of bring back the Third Reich at some point, that they were reorganizing themselves to kind of hijack the West German government. I don't think that's a stretch of the imagination, but they certainly had quite close networks, and they certainly helped one another.
Well, thank you for that description. And I have one more question. I did a short podcast episode on the movement of Nazi generals to South America in the 1940s. And the Catholic Church was involved. If you take the pro-Catholic view, they were just helping Catholics who were going to come under the Soviet Union and giving them a way to escape from that. If you take the much less sympathetic Catholic view, the Catholic Church had been very cozy with fascist governments in Italy and Spain and may have had sympathies with these Nazi generals. So that's how route lines work in the 40s. But in the 60s, what was the process by which you would leave? Would you simply use your passport and get a ship or a plane to South America and hope that you could leave before people started asking questions? Or was there more of a, coyote smuggling process?
I think the smuggling happened earlier. Those were the earlier waves, of people who got out. And the later ones were, in my grandfather's case, he wasn't being pursued at that particular moment in time, but he certainly became quite worried that he would be pursued. And so my grandparents were able to leave, on a French cruise liner out of Hamburg. But there were all sorts of creative ways. I think a lot of work has been done on this by Gerald Steinacher, who wrote Nazis on the Run, who actually tried to trace the various ways that people got out. But I would say that, through the 50s and into the late 50s and 60s, it was possible for people to, put their things together and leave as long as they had, some sort of link or network on the other end. They were given advice as to how to do things in a fairly smooth manner and got out. And the other thing was that, it wasn't that my grandfather was one of the most senior Nazis. So, and
right.
Even those most senior Nazis, such as Mengele, for example, came back for the death of his mother, I think, when it was her funeral. So, and he was able to travel as himself. So you can, yes, this is surprising. And many of these people lived without changing their names in Brazil as well, and in other Latin American countries. So, and I think what we have to understand today, it's hard for us to understand this, but what we have to understand about that time is that first of all, intelligence, German intelligence, French intelligence, many of these organizations were actually filled with people who had worked in the Vichy regime or in the Third Reich. Certainly the German Foreign Service was full of people who had served the Third Reich, and they were, they would have to be quite self-critical in order to pursue such people or identify them. So that's one of the reasons why it was actually most of these people moved around with ease. And I think we should also remember that of the thousands of former SS who went to Latin America in the post-war period, only 6 of them were ever prosecuted, and with great difficulty. And then there are all sorts of reasons for that have to do both with the way that Latin American dictatorships behaved and also the reluctance of West Germany and other European governments to pursue them. Even the United States wasn't that eager to pursue too many of them,
right?
Because for many reasons, one of them being, as far as Brazil is concerned, that the United States was more interested in having Brazil as a bulwark against what they saw as the spread of communism in the world than in making a lot of trouble and fishing out former Nazis who were living in Brazil.
Yeah, no one's hands are completely clean in this. Our NASA program with Operation Paperclip was powered by Nazi science. So
yeah,
the Saturn V rocket is a more technologically advanced V2 rocket. So there you go.
Yes, and I think overall we also need to remember, I mean, we have, in the post-war era, we have, the international community has worked quite hard on advancing the cause of human rights in the world. This was underway at that time. People's perspectives about what was necessary in order to have justice was perhaps different to how we see it today. Hopefully, we're not going downhill with our standards of human rights. There is that danger at the moment in the world. But I would say on the whole, the perspective of who needed to be brought to justice and why was different then than it is today.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. All right, well, thank you for that overview. That really sets the stage well for someone who wouldn't know all these figures and these programs going on. Your book really gets into the personal side of this story. So could you tell me, what were your motives for starting your research? Did it begin before 2010 when you found this information in the archives, or is that what kicked it off?
No, my motives go back quite far back. In fact, as far as I can remember in my life. Many families have secrets. I would say most probably have some sort of secret, but in mine, it was the nature of the secret was special and heavy. And I think as a young child, you can sense it when there's an elephant in the room and no one can talk about it. And people get angry at one another at family gatherings, and you just can't figure out why. And I think my mother was very frustrated by this, having to carry this burden, and could occasionally get quite angry about it. And instead of turning her anger towards her parents, who were, after all, the people who were responsible for this, she could get quite frustrated and angry at her children. And so I think I sensed this from a very early age and bore a sense of shame from a very early age without really knowing what that was about, simply feeling that I had done something wrong without knowing what it was. So you could say that this went back a very long way. And but as the years went on, and as I mentioned earlier, I got an education that was quite specific to researching this history. And, I had these long conversations with my grandmother, who never relinquished her ideology. So though I loved to be with her in those moments when she tossed out shards of her old ideology, I really didn't know what to do, because I wanted to continue to love her and receive the benefits of her affection, but at the same time, I knew what she was telling me was wrong, so it goes back a very long way, and I would say that the things that brought me to the German Federal Archives in April 2010 were a concern about how this continuation of the state of affairs in our family would play itself out in the next generation. So I have twins, and I didn't want them to go around with the same sense of shame, and I certainly didn't want whatever it was that was infecting our family to infect the relationships in my new family. So it really was, I was in a state of desperation, and wanted to try to understand how, whatever the history was, I wanted to understand it and then try to figure out how it had impacted our relationships.
I have a question about what you said, that your grandmother still held on to her ideology. What does that mean to hold on to an ideology when the army and the government that supported it, the Third Reich, collapsed? It utterly failed. One would think that National Socialism has been completely discredited. So what did that look like with her?
Yeah, you have to wonder how it's possible to do that with those facts in mind, and the fact that the entire country had been brought to ruin, was more or less leveled. Well, what it looked like was that, many of these conversations are also portrayed in the memoir, so I'll go back to them. I mean, it really was that she took a revisionist approach and claimed that the Holocaust hadn't actually taken place, and that this was simply an argument that was made by the global media after the war to keep Germany down. So remember that my grandmother was born in 1912 and had lived through 2 world wars. And the First World War, she was in her formative years in the aftermath of the First World War. And indeed, at that time, the victors did try to keep Germany down. They imposed very harsh conditions on Germany, which, as we know, resulted in dire economic conditions in Germany during the 1920s. But she used this as an argument to claim that the Holocaust hadn't taken place. Now, I don't know if she actually believed that or not, and I can, at some point she must have known that this was not right, because after all, she and her husband were stationed throughout the duration of the war in 1 hour. Well, first of all, they were stationed in the middle of all these camps and this kind of experimental place of the SS, where they were killing so many people and waging their racial war. At the same time, I think that at some point, a lie that you've told enough times becomes your new reality. I think we see that today among many people, the whole business of alternative facts and so forth. So I think this became her new reality, and she freely shared it with me. And she was also quite disparaging about people from the East. So she retained her racial views and believed that Slavs were degenerate. So, for example, when I stayed in a hotel in her neighborhood run by Eastern Europeans, she wondered how I could possibly stand it, because it must be awful and dirty and so forth. And she had a belief that was very it was very characteristic of a Nazi perspective of the world and how things were, which is that nature was this. She tried to dispense with religion, at least her Christian religion, and replace it with a kind of religion of nature, in which her belief was that the strong had the right over the weak, or whoever she perceived to be weak. And this is a very fascist idea, that we should simply let the weak die out. We shouldn't have a compassionate approach to things, because that's not the way nature works. Basically, nature just weeds out what doesn't deserve to survive. So, for example, she would be constantly coming up with examples of this, such as people who have, AIDS should simply be allowed to die. People with mental health problems should be relieved of their misery and things like that. These are very Nazi ideas, and they were for me. It was I wanted to stand up and scream a lot of the time, but I didn't, because she was my grandmother, and I wanted to maintain a good relationship with her.
Yeah, thanks for describing how complex complicity can be, because I think we would all like to assume that with the Holocaust, it was the good people on one side and then mustache twirling villains on the other side, and there's no gray. But A system like that that's so expansive and far-reaching couldn't work if there wasn't mass participation.